Congratulations on making it to Chapter 8 of the Complete Web Developer course. Let's take a moment to see how much you've covered. We began with setting up your free hosting and your control panel and uploading files to your server. Then we learned about HTML, the structure, and the ways that you can create a website using HTML. Then we looked at cascading style sheets, applying styles to individual elements, classes and IDs, moving those elements around, and we spent quite a long time recreating the BBC News website. Then we learned about JavaScript, making your website interactive, and then doing some reasonably advanced coding using if statements, for loops, and functions. We then looked at jQuery, a JavaScript framework, and we found various ways to make our websites more interactive and compelling. Then we looked at Twitter Bootstrap and how you can make a great looking website extremely quickly, and some of the functions that Twitter Bootstrap allows. We then moved on to WordPress, your first content management system, and how you can use that to create a blog and a shop and all sorts of other websites. Then we learned about PHP, our first server-side programming language. We learned about all the usual basics, variables, arrays, if statements, for loops, etc., and some more advanced features like sending email, get and post variables. And then we created a contact form and a weather scraper. Almost the last piece of the puzzle was MySQL, which was a database framework which acted as the memory of our website. We learned how to store information in a database, connect to that database, retrieve our data, and then create a pretty nice diary website which stored the diary entry of a particular user. So now we're going to look at APIs. Specifically, we're going to look at two APIs, the Google Maps API and the Twitter API. But before we do that, let's just find out what on earth an API is. API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's essentially how two computers talk to each other. So your website or your app will make a request to an API of a particular service, that might be Google Maps, Twitter, Facebook, anything like that, and then their app will return data. So for example, you might request data from Google Maps about the geolocation data for a particular postcode or zip code. Or you may request some information from Facebook about a user. Or you may want to post to Twitter for a particular user. An API will allow you to do all of those things. This means that using APIs, you can connect your websites and apps to those of existing services to add features and create exciting products. So let's dive right in and find out how it works. The first API we're going to look at is the Google Maps API, and we're going to look at two different formats of it. The first one is the Google Maps JavaScript API, which allows you to embed Google Maps in your websites and do various things with them. So let's see how that works. So here I've just got the Google search page for Google Maps JavaScript API. I'd recommend doing that if you want to find the docs at any point. So to get started, we click the blue button. Now the first thing that we need to do is create an API key. Most APIs have some kind of authentication system so that the server knows which user is requesting various bits of data. This is mostly to control how much you use the application, so if your website gets very popular, Google or Twitter or whoever it might be can start charging you or limit your access to the API if they need to. So obtaining an API key is reasonably straightforward. We're going to click on that link there where we can log in to our console. We just click Create Project, and then it will create a set of possible APIs that we can switch on and off. We want the Google Maps API, JavaScript API version 3. So let's switch that on, agree to the terms, and now we should be up and running with the Google Maps JavaScript API. So the limit here is 25,000 requests per day. That's pretty generous. You're going to be able to get quite a long way before you actually get charged money by Google to use their Google Maps JavaScript API. So to use the API, we click API Access, and then our key here is essentially our identifier. That's what we're going to use with our Google Maps API to identify ourselves and tell Google who we are when we're requesting information from them. Right, so I'll keep that open in the browser, and then we'll just have a look further down the Google Docs. So this is our hello world for Google Maps on the JavaScript API. Essentially, it's a HTML document. You should be familiar with the layout. And let's just have a quick look at the code here before we start running it. We're creating a function called initialize, which essentially just starts up the map and displays it for us. We define an array called map options, which contains the options for the map that we want to display. We start by giving it latitude and longitude coordinates for where we want the center of the map to be. And then we create a variable zoom, which says what do we want the zoom to be when we start. So there are various zoom levels, and in this example we're starting at a zoom level of 8. And then finally we create another variable called map, which is essentially a new Google Maps map, and it's going to go into the map canvas element, which you can see is down here. So you remember the getElementById function? That just gets the element map canvas and then puts the Google map onto it with the various map options. Great, so that's our function that creates the map. And then here we add a DOM listener, which essentially runs the initialize function when the window loads. So it waits for the website to finish loading, and then it runs the initialize function, which puts the map into the map canvas div. Great, so let's try and run this and see if we can make it work. So I'm going to bring in FireFTP and connect to my test domain name. And I'm going to create a new folder. I'll just bring that in for you. A new folder called APIs. And a new file called, we'll call it maps.html. We're not using PHP here, so we'll just use a straightforward HTML file. Okay, and then I'm going to open that document in Text Wrangler and just put some test text there. I like to be sure that my document is going to work. So then we just find any test domain will do, or will work, and /APIs/maps.html. There we go. So there's my test file that I've created. Take a few moments to do that. Get yourself there. And then we'll switch back to the Google Maps docs. Copy that over. Paste it into here. And then we only need to change our key. So there's our API key. And then I just replace API key there with my Google Maps API key. So you notice all this is doing is loading a JavaScript file from the Google Maps API domain and then running it. That's all that's going on. The only other thing that we need to change is the sensor variable, which is simply a statement to Google as to whether or not you are using GPS or some other sensor to establish the user's location. We're not doing that, so we're just going to set it to false. Right, so I've saved that. Let's now refresh the page. There we go, there's our Google Maps. So the latitude and longitude of the default centers us on Sydney, and then we can of course scroll around, zoom in and out, as you're probably very used to doing with Google Maps. And that's all embedded on our page. So I'd advise you spend a little bit of time with that, maybe experimenting with different longitudes and latitudes and different zoom values. If we just try that out, let's try a zoom value of 3, see what difference that makes. We're now much more zoomed out than we were before, and we can try setting the longitude and latitude values to something else. Let's try 0 and 0, see where that gets us. There we go, centers the map nicely. Okay, I'd recommend trying out doing things like running the initialize function not on the page load, but when the user clicks a button or something like that, or moving things around when something happens on the page. So definitely spend a few minutes just playing around with that and seeing what you can make it do. And then we'll go on to look at another Google Maps API. So we've seen how we can get a map from Google Maps servers and display it on our website. That's great, but let's look at another type of API which allows you to take data more directly into your code and then do something with it. So we're going to look at the Google Geocoding API as an example of this. Geocoding is the process of taking an address and making it into a pair of longitude and latitude coordinates, or getting some more information about it, so making a more precise statement of what the address is. Reverse geocoding is the opposite process. Sometimes you've got a pair of latitude and longitude coordinates and you want to convert those into an address. So the Google Geocoding API will do both of those for you. Let's take a look and see how we get started. So as before, we need to request an API key. So let's do that in the same way as before. Okay, click on Services, and I want the Google Maps Geolocation API. So I'm going to switch that on and accept the terms and conditions. Let's take a look. We want the geocoding API. So let's find that one and switch it on. So we can see that we're allowed 2,500 requests per day to this particular API. Okay, so that's all on, that's great. And we can use the same API code as before. So how do we actually access this particular API? Let's use one of their examples. Actually, we'll focus on XML. Let's paste that URL into our text document so that we can have a good look at it. So all it's doing is contacting the Google API's server and taking our address, so in this case 1600 Amphitheatre Parkway, Mountain View, and taking our sensor variable once again. So we're going to want to set that to false, and our API key. So let's copy in our API key from our script. So you can see this is just a URL. All we're doing is finding the content of a website again, essentially. So let's take a look. If we then run that, okay. So this returns what's called an XML file. XML is a specific file type that we normally use to store data and responses from servers in this sort of situation. So you can see how the file is structured there. We've got tags for various bits of data. So the first one is our status, and everything's fine, it's okay. And then we've got our result. And within the result set of tags, we've got our type of result, and then our formatted address, etc. And then each of the components of the address is formatted for us very conveniently. So we've got the full details there of the address, and then down at the bottom we've got the longitude and latitude of the address, which is what we were looking for in terms of our geocoding. So that's the XML document that is returned by Google servers when you request that particular URL. So let's find out how we can actually do something with this. So I'm going to use this HTML document that we've already got, but get rid of what we don't need. We're not using the JavaScript API anymore. We're just going to do our code in here. So we're going to use the jQuery AJAX function. So we need to start by calling jQuery. So I've got my Google API's jQuery link there. So now we've got our jQuery, and what we want to do is run an AJAX call onto this URL and then process the response. Now, there's something important to be aware of here, and that's known as cross-domain requests. Normally, when you use AJAX, you can only download information that's on your server. So if you try and use AJAX to contact another server, as we're doing here, contact googleapis.com, then that's not going to work. The request will be denied. But there are a few exceptions to that, and they're notably XML and JSON. So JSON we'll look at later on, but for XML, if you try and request an XML file from another server, and that server has allowed you to do that, then you'll be able to download the XML with your AJAX. So bear that in mind. If you try and use AJAX to generically take some data from another server, it probably will not work. But if it's been allowed and it's of an XML format or a JSON format, then you can do it. So that's what we're going to do here. Fortunately, Google do allow cross-domain requests for their Google APIs server. So let's see how we do it. Well, we use the AJAX function, which we saw back in the jQuery chapter. We have to use AJAX because it's the only function that allows us to specify what type of data we want to get, and we need to specify that we want to collect XML data here. So I'm going to put my AJAX options inside those curly brackets. First, I need to give the type of request, and it's a GET request. The other option that you might want to use is a POST request when you're sending POST variables, but we're not doing that here. We're just collecting a URL. And indeed, the next option we need to give is the URL. So that's this big long string there. Remember, with the address on it, our sensor is equal to false, and there's our API key after that. We then need to specify the data type, and that's equal to, sorry, it should be small characters. So the data type is XML, and our last option is what to do when the AJAX function is successful. So we'll create a function, and we'll call it process XML. So when the AJAX call is complete, it will process the XML using our process XML function. Okay, so let's now just create our process XML function. We need one variable in our function, and that is the XML itself. So we'll call the variable for that XML. Ooh, might want to spell function correctly. So for the moment, we'll just very simply alert done. I like to do an alert first time round just to make sure that everything's okay before we do anything more complicated. So let's shut that down and run that. Done. Okay, looking good. So something's happening. What happens if we try and just alert the XML itself? We get a strange result. That's because the JavaScript sees this XML not as a string, but as an XML object. So we can't just view it or deal with it like we can a string. We have to process it in a slightly more complicated way. We can use the jQuery find function to loop through the XML and find the particular bits of information that we're interested in. So to show you how this works, we need to grab the XML object and turn it into a jQuery object that we can process, and we do that using string and then XML. And then we want to use the find command. And for now, let's just find the status tag. So we know there's only one status tag at the very top there. So let's find that one. And then we just add text to get the text within the status tag in the XML. So that should return OK. Let's alert it and take a look. Switch back over here. Fantastic. So it's got the right tag for us, and it's established the content of the status tag and then returned it. Brilliant. Now, what if we want to loop through some content, such as the address components, and work our way through each one of those? What we do, we've seen before the jQuery each function. So the each function loops through lots of different values of find, essentially. So if we changed the find string from status to, say, address component, then it will loop through all of the different address component tags and return the data one by one. Let's see how we can do that. So for each instance of the each function, we want to run a function like that, and for now we'll just alert. We want to get rid of this alert now, sorry. So we're looking at the XML, we're finding all the address component tags, and we're looping through each of them, and we're going to alert this dot text. So that will alert the text in each of the address component tags. So let's see that working. And there we go. So the first tag has the street number values. The second has the route, the road name, locality, etc. We can view each of those in action. Brilliant. Now, what if we want to find one of those in particular? Well, then if we take a quick look at the XML, we can see that each of the address component sections has got a type tag within it. So let's say we're particularly interested in the postal code and we want to get the postcode of a particular address. Then, so we want to search through this, that is the contents of the address component section that we're looking at. So it's going to be something like that, and we want to find the type tag. And then once we've found it, we want to return the text within it. So we want to find when it's equal to postal code is what we're going to do when we want to find the postcode. But at the moment, we'll just alert that. Let's see how that works. Okay. So it starts off returning street number, then route, then locality, political. That one's actually got two types, I think, and that one's got more than one as well. So let's take a look what it's done there. So the first type is street number, and then route, and then there's more than one type with each of those. So if we want to find the postal code specifically, then what we want is to look for when that text is equal to postal code. And then we want to do something when we found it. Let's say we'll return the long name. So see if you can do that. Quick exercise for you. See if you can return the long name which will contain the postal code or zip code. I hope you did something like looking at this again, but this time we're finding the long name. And let's alert it. And the thing that we want to alert is the text. You can see the error I made there. Long name would be better than log name. Let's try that again. Great. So it's returned the content of the long name field inside this particular bit of text. So that's how you process an XML file using jQuery and get the data that you want from it. I would definitely recommend spending a bit of time playing around with that and working out how to return various other bits of information. So maybe try and establish how to get the short name of the country and location type, etc., and latitude and longitude we'll be finding as well. And when you've done that, jump onto the next video where we're going to be creating a simple postcode finder app. The challenges in this chapter are going to work slightly differently to the challenges in previous chapters. We're going to have two of them because we're focusing on two different APIs. So the first challenge is going to be reasonably straightforward. We're going to make a postcode finder. So it's a website where you put an address in and it will return the postcode of that particular address. It's a reasonably useful function that someone might want to use if they want to send a letter but they don't know the postcode of the address. Now this is a website that you can definitely make from scratch with the skills that you've covered in the last couple of videos. So I'd definitely recommend, if you're feeling confident, go away and make the website and try and do it completely on your own. And as always, I'd be really interested in seeing the result. But I will run through it in case you want to follow along, and let's kick off with that now. So I'm going to start by bringing in Firefox and creating a new file. In fact, I'm going to copy a file over. So I'm going to take the weather website that we created last time, and I'm just going to copy that over to form the basis of our app. We don't need to recreate the wheel again. So in PHP here, we've got our background file, our index.php, and our scraper file. And the only one of those that I actually need is the PHP file. So I've got that. And there it is. So I'm just going to upload that. And to keep things in order, I'll rename it to postcodefinder.php. Now the background that I'm going to use for this app is one that I found on a website called Unsplash. So I'm going to use this one. It's got a kind of city feel to it, so it should work well. It's a big file, so it'll take a little while to download. Take quite a long while to download, in fact. I'll jump ahead for you. There we go. So I'll just save it on the desktop as background.jpg for the moment. And then, as before in preview, I'm going to just resize it 1200 pixels should be fine. Okay, and then I'll just save that. And then back to my FTP server. There it is on the desktop. So I'm going to upload that. So the two files that I'm really focused on are postcodefinder.php and background.jpg. So let's open Postcode Finder. That's the one we're going to be working with. Move this out the way. We don't need preview working. Okay, so APIs and postcode finder.html. Oh, .php, wasn't it? Yeah, we don't actually need it to be .php. It's not a problem, but we're not going to be using any PHP here. Okay, so I don't think the white works particularly well here. So let's get rid of that. We'll just remove the white class from both of those. Unfortunately, the dark class doesn't work particularly well either. So let's give this div another class of white background. And then we'll just give it a background color of white. And it'll probably need a bit of padding. And let's add a border radius as well. Great. Okay, so that'll do the job. It's not quite as neat as having it straight over the photograph, but it's a nice alternative if you've got a photograph like this that has lots of different shades and it's not easy to find a text color that easily goes over the top. So we want to change the title to Postcode Finder. And then this time the instructions are enter any address to find the postcode. Great. And we'll just change the address to 63 Fake Street, Fake Town. And we'll change the button to Find My Postcode. There we go. Great. So now we just need to make it work. We just need to use the Google Maps API to return the postcode that we're interested in. So we want to do that when the button is clicked. So let's keep this function, but we'll change the ID of the div. Keep everything making sense. So find my postcode. There we go. And just to check that everything is well. Great. Okay. So this is the area where we're going to return our code. So let's switch over temporarily to our maps file with our Ajax instruction. Get rid of FireFTP. And there we go. So we've got our Ajax call, which runs a GET request on this URL, returns some XML, and then processes the XML. And in fact, we've already got some instruction which gets the postcode for us. So we don't need to do that much in this project to make it work. If you want to play around with it, which I definitely recommend, maybe do something different to a postcode finder. You could do a latitude and longitude finder or something like that. So let's just check that that works first of all when we press the button. So we'll just refresh that, press the button, and there we go. So it's returned the postcode. Obviously that is the postcode of 1600 Amphitheatre Parkway. It's not any address that we've typed in. So let's start by fixing that. So here's the address that we want to change. So we're going to take the address from the input field here. So let's have a look. What do we call the ID of the input field? So we've called it city. Let's rename it to be address so that this makes sense. So address there. So we want to replace the address with I'm using single quotes. The value of the address field. There we go. Now we have a problem there though. If the address happens to contain double quotes, this is going to give us problems. And Google Maps actually expects the address to be in a URL friendly format. So we don't really want to put lots of spaces and things in there. Even though it will probably work, it's better to encode the address into a URL safe format. Fortunately, there's a JavaScript function that does that for us. Encode URI component. Like that. So now, if we put an address in, it should actually find the postcode of that address. 25 Mill Road, Cambridge. And there we go. There's the postcode. Okay, so we just need a little bit of refinement to make this app work nicely. We don't really want to alert the postcode. We want to do something else with it. So let's use our success alerts here. And if you remember what we did last time, we took our success alert, so that's ID success, and we faded it in like that, and then we want to give the success ID HTML of, let's have something like the postcode you need is and then we'll put in the text that we've got there. Great, we can actually combine those to a single instruction, so let's do that. To make it a bit neater, and probably best to change the HTML before we fade it in. Just a couple of things I want to change there. Let's put the plus in the right place. And I'm going to use single quotes just to be sure on the thing that I'm finding there. Okay, so let's try that out. So we'll stick with 25 Mill Road for the moment. There we go. We've got our postcode. Fantastic. Let's try a few others. Stick with Cambridge. Roads that I know. Great. And then let's have 10 Colindale Avenue in the wonderful town of Sidcup. There's the postcode, correct. Brilliant. Okay, so it's doing a great job of getting the postcodes of the addresses that we want. Let's do a couple of things just to neaten it up a little bit. We want to have some kind of error system. So if I put in a load of gobbledygook, it's not going to return anything. So we need to have a system for saying that we can't find a result for that particular address. So that's easy enough to do. We'll create a variable and we'll call it result and set it equal to, actually let's call it 0 by default. And then once we get a success, we'll set the result equal to 1. And then outside of the function we can test for if result is still equal to 0, then do something. So we've already got a couple of error divs that we can use, I think. So we'll just say could not find postcode for that address. Please try again. So that's our fail div. So we simply use fail fade in. Now remember we had the issue last time that once this happens we can have more than one message at once. So let's start by, as soon as the function is clicked, we'll hide all of the alerts. And then we'll only have one function at once. So if I now put in some gobbledygook there, couldn't find postcode, simply because Google Maps is not going to return a postcode for some gobbledygook. It would be good also to, well, if we enter nothing, we still get that error. So to be honest, that's a good enough error for entering nothing. We don't need to have a separate error for please enter your city, I don't think. But what happens if the whole process fails and we're not actually able to connect to Google for whatever reason? Maybe our API key has been used up too much, or the user's not actually connected to the internet. Well, that's easy enough to deal with as long as you're using this AJAX function. So let's create our error function. And just as a test, let's alert failed. And what I've done here is I've removed the H from the HTTPS, which will definitely make it fail because the address is no longer correct. So let's just try that. Excellent. So it's picked up the failure, but let's fail slightly more elegantly. We want to bring in a new fail div. So let's create a new div as a copy of that one. We'll call it fail2. And we'll just say could not connect to server. So you might want to add a more detailed error message there if you like. So we just need to get the fail2 div and fade it in. Okay, let's try that. Excellent, much nicer. And let's get it back again. See what happens if we type in 63 Fake Street. And we get a postcode. Nice. Right, we'll leave it there with our postcode finder. One thing that you might want to do to improve this is, in some cases, such as this one, the Google Maps server will probably return a number of different results, different possible addresses. Let's see that, for example. If we give it a quite generic looking postcode, let's say 10 Smith Road. Probably a lot of those around. So if I now search for postal code, we've got one there, and then there's another one, and then there's a third. So what our script will do is just pick one of them and assign that one to this value here. In fact, it'll probably be the last one of the three. So what would be a nice way to improve on this app would be to give them a choice and display all the possible addresses along with their postcodes. But I'll leave that to you to improve, and possibly you could find some other improvements as well. Maybe displaying the map with the coordinates of the address centered would be really nice as well. But see what you can do with it, play around with it, and as always, post it in the forums. So far in this chapter, we've looked at two different types of API. We've looked at the Google Maps JavaScript API, which enabled us to embed Google Maps onto our web page and control how they look. And then we looked at the Google Geolocation API, which is a different sort of API that returns XML, and then we processed that XML with jQuery and made a quick website to find a postcode of an address using that. So now we're going to look at another different type of API, and we're going to focus on Twitter's API. So two different things about this. One is that it uses JSON rather than XML. So we'll find out what JSON is and how we deal with that. And the second, we're going to connect to it using PHP rather than JavaScript. Now, because it uses a certain type of authentication, which we'll look at in a moment, it's strongly discouraged to use client-side JavaScript with the Twitter API. So we'll use it as an opportunity to practice connecting with an API and doing something using PHP. So in this video, we'll just set up our access to the Twitter API. So just like with Google Maps, you do need to sign up, but it's a slightly more laborious process with Twitter. So let's see how we do it. So TechEdRob is my username. So let's scroll down and click Get Started with the platform. If you want to spend a bit of time here, that would be great. Have a good look around. There's a lot of useful information on the Twitter API here, and of course you'll learn a lot about APIs in general. But we're going to jump straight to Manage Your Apps. I've got one app here, but I'm focused on creating a new one for now. So to connect with Twitter, you need to create an app, even if you want to do something pretty basic. So an app is just a way of connecting to the Twitter API, essentially. So I'm going to call this test app, and it's going to be the Complete Web Developer course. Description, test app for the Complete Web Developer course, and I'm going to be running it from Complete Web Developer course.com. We don't need a callback URL. Remember from JavaScript that a callback is something that the script does on completion. So if you want to see where your app is being used, or you want to keep track of every use, you might want to specify a callback URL which then documents that particular use in a database or something like that. But we're not going to do that here. I'm going to agree to the terms and conditions and then create our application. Right, it wants me to put HTTP in front of the website. Great, there we go. So we've created our test app, and the crucial thing that we're interested in is the API keys. So here they are. With OAuth, you have an API key and an API secret. I won't go into great details about how the security works, but essentially the API key is something that could be public. It doesn't matter if other people know your API key, but the API secret is something that should definitely be kept private. So this is something that would allow someone else to use your app. So definitely do not share your API secret with the world. We now need to create an access token for our app, which will allow us to access the app directly. So it's been created, but it does take a little while to be visible. If I refresh now, it's not quite there. Okay, we'll come back to it in a minute. It will appear shortly. Just refresh again. There we go. So there's that access token. And again, the secret should never be made public. So that's the process of creating a Twitter app and getting the API keys which will be necessary to connect to the Twitter API. In the next video, we'll find out how to do that with PHP. Now that we've logged into Twitter and created our app and got our API keys, we need to find a way to connect to Twitter using PHP. And we're going to do that using a library. There are a number of libraries out there that you can use to connect with OAuth in general and to Twitter specifically. OAuth, by the way, is an open web standard for security, so securely connecting to another machine, usually as part of an API. So I'm going to download a zip containing all the files in this repository. There we go, and then we'll just unzip that. And there it is. We're going to upload that to our server. So let's bring in FireFTP and upload some files. If I go to the desktop, there it is. And I'll upload it to inside the public HTML file folder. We won't need all of the files here, but we'll upload them all anyway, just to keep things simple. Now, you can create a connection just by using the files that are given to you and filling in the blanks, essentially. But we're going to do it slightly more from scratch, just so that we can get a slightly better idea of what's going on. So I'm going to create a file called twitter.php and then open that file. As always, I'm just going to do a test. It's in twitter.php. There we go. Okay, so we're up and running. So let's start PHP. It's best to have sessions going when you're doing this. It just makes some features work better when you keep your session variables active. So we'll start the session to begin with, and then you remember the PHP include function. Use that to include a file. I'll just show you the one we're going to include. There's one key file, which is this one. So it's in the Twitter OAuth directory, and it's called twitteroauth.php. So Twitter OAuth /Twitter OAuth.php. Great. Now we need to set up our variables. So we want to, on our app, have our access token, our secret, our API key, and our API secret. We'll probably want to access those from a number of different places, so it's useful to have variables set equal to the value of them so that we can refer to those. So very simply, API key, I'll copy them over in a second, API secret, access token, and access secret. It doesn't matter what you call them. Then let's just copy that lot over. Great, there we go. So to make a connection, we create a connection variable, and then we use the syntax new to create a new connection. And we're actually creating an object here called Twitter OAuth. Object-oriented programming is something that we haven't touched on yet, and I'm not going to go into in great detail in this course, but essentially it involves creating objects and then creating instances of them, and that's what we're doing here. So we're creating a new instance of the Twitter OAuth object, and we pass the object all of our details, so API key, API secret, access token, and access secret. Just bring that in there. We can then just see what that connection object looks like. It's arrow. Let's have a look at that. So there we go. This is our Twitter OAuth object, and it just contains all the data that we need to connect to the Twitter API. We haven't actually done the connection yet. To do that, we need to make a request. So let's do that now. Just before we do that, let's check the Twitter documentation for the user timeline command. So if we just Google that, there we go, that's the one we want. So the Twitter documentation tells you everything that you need to know about each of the commands that you might want to use. So this is a fairly basic one. It gets the 20 most recent statuses posted by the particular user. So let's scroll straight down and copy an example. So that's the URL, just like the Google Maps URL, that we're going to access via our PHP script. Now we need to use our OAuth connection, so we can't just use file get contents or something like that. We need to be authenticated. So we use connection and then get. So again, this is object-oriented language, which essentially means we want to do the get function on the connection object. So the get function is much like the file get contents function. It just connects to the Twitter API and downloads the contents of a URL whilst being logged in via OAuth. So I'm just pasting now that Twitter example URL, and then I want to set that equal to a value, so let's call it tweets, because this is going to be our collection of tweets. Okay, and then let's just display that result and see what it looks like. Okay, we've got the REST API version 1 is no longer active. Google has let us down and has taken us to version 1 of the Twitter API, which is no longer active. But changing that to version 1.1 is easy. You just change the URL from 1 to 1.1. And then we'll try again. Okay, here we go. So that's our response. Yikes. Obviously, we're going to need to do a bit of work to make that look nice. But let's just have a quick look through and see what this response is doing. So as with the Google Maps API, we start with getting some basic information, so an ID, date, time, all of that sort of thing. And then if we scroll down, we're given some information about the user that we've requested the tweets from. So this is the Twitter API user. We've got the location, description, direct URL, etc., etc. And then we've got some information about the follow account and various other bits of information about that user. So that's already very useful. We can get a lot of information about a user from this data. And then we go into a set of information about each individual tweet. So here's the latest tweet. There's the text of it. And then we've got various bits of information about it again. So the source, the ID, etc., etc. And again, follow account. Number of people that have favorited that tweet, etc. And then if we scroll down a bit further, we can see another second tweet there. So there's more text. More text. And then some more data at the bottom there. So we've got a whole range of data that we could do a whole load of stuff with from this single API request. So that's how you connect to the Twitter API using PHP. In the next video, we're going to look at actually processing this response and doing something with it. You'll hopefully remember that the Google Maps API that we used returned its results in XML. And I've already mentioned that the Twitter API returns its results in JSON. So what is this strange thing called JSON? Well, essentially, it's very similar to XML. It's a format for displaying and returning data in a clean and light format. If you want to know more about it, there's a great Stack Overflow question, what is JSON and why would I use it? So have a look there. We've got the name. It's actually a JavaScript object notation is what it stands for, but it's not JavaScript specific. It's very much cross-language. You can use any language to access JSON and do things with it. To give you a quick idea of what it looks like this. So it's all about curly brackets all over the place, and essentially we've got name value pairs of various items, and then you can have sub arrays as they essentially are, etc. So that's what JSON is. What we need to know really is how we parse it, that is how we deal with it in PHP. So first of all, let's have a look and see what the JSON object here actually looks like. Because what our code has done is it's converted it into an object for us. So we can use the function JSON encode to see the JSON itself, and there you can see the square and curly brackets that we saw. So this is actually the raw text that the Twitter API is giving out. So what you would do if you had your response in its raw JSON format, you just use JSON decode, and then that will turn it into an array that you can deal with easily. But we already have our object, so we'll use this as an opportunity to look at some of the object-oriented language. So let's start processing this. We've got two main arrays here. We've got the 0 array and the one there, and they're the two tweets that we're returning. There's only two tweets here. We could make it a bit more interesting by upping the count to 10. So let's say first of all we want to display just the text of the tweet, so the tweet content. So that's here in the text field there. So the easiest way to do that is to just use for each. So hopefully you can remember we can use tweets as tweet. So that will then loop through the tweets array and return each individual tweet object in the tweet variable. So if I want to access the text of this tweet object, all I do is echo tweet and then text. And that arrow again is returning a particular variable within the tweet object. So So let's take a look. Oh, I'll get rid of this. Displaying the whole array. There we go. Maybe we'll echo a line break so we can see them a bit more clearly. But there we go. So we've found the 10 most recent tweets on this particular screen name. We could, of course, very easily change the screen name to anything we like. So let's check out Bill Gates. See what he's got to say. Just have to update the screen name there. And there we go. There's the 10 latest tweets for Bill Gates. Fantastic. So we've found a way to just display tweets and then deal with them. What if we wanted to look at the number of favorites that each tweet has? Well, that's pretty straightforward as well. If we have a look here, there's a variable favorite count. So all we need to do is access that variable, which we can do in the same way as we did tweet text. So tweet and then favorite count. Let's have a look at that. There we go. So now we've got the number of favorites at the end of each of Bill Gates' tweets. Fantastic. And of course, you're very welcome, and I would strongly encourage that you play around with this a little bit and see if you can access some of the inner bits of information. So you just have to do a for each on the user object there, and that will allow you to access anything inside that object. And you can get all sorts of information, of course, from this. So in the next video, we're going to look at some of the other functions we can use with the Twitter API. So we've seen how to connect to the Twitter API, how to request a list of tweets for a particular user, and then do something with that, looking at the number of favorites or finding out some other information about it. So let's just have a quick look at some of the other functions that the Twitter API allows. And we'll also find out how to post a tweet for the authenticated user. So if we have a look at the Twitter API documentation, you can see all of the various options that you've got here, and I won't go through them all, but we'll have a quick look at them. So this first function here gets a list of the most recent mentions of a particular user, and it works in exactly the same way as the command that we saw in the last video. So let's just copy and paste the URL there. So this time, when we refresh that, we'll get my most recent 2 mentions. It's a great one there. Check your email. Notice we can only do this with the authenticated account. We can't go in there and find the mentions of any user, only the person who has logged in, so only me essentially in this particular case, or only you when you're trying this out for yourself. So rather than go through all of these, I'll strongly encourage you to have a look at them and play around with them and see what you can do. Access to direct messages, followers, users, etc., etc. There's loads of stuff there that you can work with. But the other thing that we're going to particularly focus on in this video is how to post a tweet. So first of all, you may have noticed that when we created our app, we had an access level option. So at the moment, our app is read only. If we want to be able to post tweets with our app, we need to ask for read and write permissions. If we wanted to send direct messages, we'd need that third option. It's definitely best to only give the level of access that you actually need, so that if someone else does happen to access your app or gets access to your secret, then they can do hopefully less damage than they would otherwise. So we'll activate read and write access. And again, it may take a moment or two for it to update, but by the time we get there, I'm sure it will have done. So how do we post a tweet using the API? Well, let's have a look at the Twitter API docs again. So the command to post a status update is a post rather than a get. So that's very slightly more complicated. Essentially, we need to access a URL and then post data to that URL. So we can do that with our script over here. As you might guess, we use the post command rather than the get command. And then we select the URL. And paste it in. There we go. And then we add an array with status. If we have a look at the post data required by this particular function, it requires a single variable status with a value of the tweet that we want to post. So status, and then I'm just going to post this is a test. We should really have quotes around status as well, and then we'll close our array. Great. One thing we need to do before we get that working is create new API keys, because the access token that we had before is a read-only token, so we're going to need to regenerate that in order to make it a read and write token. So let's refresh that. Excellent, there's the new token with read and write access. So I'll just replace that and then replace the secret. There we go. And then we add an array. And we need to use status as our variable name. And I'm just going to do this is a test as my post. Close my array. And let's run that. Okay, great. Looks like it's worked. Let's have a look at my Twitter timeline and see if the tweet is there. There it is. Fantastic. Okay, I'll just delete that. I don't really want it in my timeline. So there we go. So now you know how to post a tweet using the Twitter API, and we've had a good look at some of the other functions that we can use in the Twitter API. So in the next video, we'll look at a very simple app that we can create using the Twitter API, which I hope will clean up your Twitter timeline. The second challenge for the APIs section of the course involves creating a simple Twitter app which analyzes the timeline of the registered user and only returns tweets that have a certain number of favorites. I was looking at my Twitter feed and realized that it was full of a lot of junk that I'm not necessarily interested in reading. So I thought it would be useful to create an app that only gives me the top tweets in my timeline, and that will then speed things up, and I can just look at that once a day and see the most important things that are going on with the people that I follow. So this, like the previous challenge, is definitely one that you can do completely on your own. So I would recommend doing as much as you can without watching this video, and then perhaps watch it and see how I solve it. Here's the Twitter API resources. So this is the command you're going to need, the getStatus's home timeline command, and that just returns a list of the latest however many tweets you want, up to 800. So that's going to be the main command that we use with Twitter. So I'll give you a few moments to pause the video and try creating something yourself. Okay, let's see how we might do this then. I'm going to click on the home timeline function. So the resource URL is there. I'm going to scroll down to get a nice example, which in fact is exactly the same as the resource URL because we're not sending any bits of information here. We're just getting a response. So there's our response. I've just used the same app that we created before. And now let's have a look and see what sort of a response we get there. So there we go. These are the latest tweets in my timeline. So if I have a little look at that as the source, we can scroll down, see as many as we like there. So the main feature of this app is going to be to count the number of favorites of each tweet and then only return those tweets that have a certain number of favorites. So let's remember how to do that. If we look at this key variable here, so favorites count, that's what we're going to need. So if you haven't already done this, have a go at looping through all of the tweets and just returning the favorites count of each tweet. Okay, the way I would do it is using for each and response as tweet, because each particular object in this array is a tweet. So the value that I want is the favorite count here. So I'll copy that and then echo tweet favorite count. Okay, let's take a look. Great, there we go. So returning the number of favorites of each tweet. So really what I want to do is just return the number of tweets. Let's say, so the vast majority have got 0 favorites. Let's just return any that have 2 or more. So that should return 1, 2, 3, 4 tweets here. So let's create a variable favorites. I'll keep the American spelling for now. Is there, and then we just want to check if favorites is greater than 2, then display the tweet. If you remember, the tweet content is just the text value there. So echo tweet text. Okay, there we go. Great. In fact, because I did greater than 2, it didn't actually return those with 2. I'll change it to greater than or equal to, so that we now get 2 and above. Great. That's perhaps not enough. If we take a look at the documentation, we can see that we can add a count parameter here. So let's up that a bit, given that we're only going to take a relatively small number of these tweets. Let's change the count to be 100. And then let's refresh that. Great, so we've got a nice number of tweets to deal with there. That's probably enough to be looking at. You can obviously play around with these numbers with your own Twitter feed and decide what works best for you. Now, it would be nice to be able to display these tweets rather nicer than just giving the text. We could use Twitter's default format. So of course we could extract all of the data and display it any way we like, but a nice shortcut would be to just use Twitter's embed command. Fortunately, there is a function oembed which does this for us. So if we search for oembed Twitter, make sure we're using the right version of the API, 1.1. So this takes a particular ID of a tweet and then returns the actual HTML code to create a nice embedded view of the tweet. So this is the request that we need. So really what we want to do is change this so that instead of just echoing the tweet text, we now return the tweet embed code. So we're going to need a new response. I want to call it something else, so let's call it embed, and then we'll need the array to be changing. So let's replace that. Sorry, do that again. Okay, so we need to replace the ID with the ID of our tweet. So how do we get that? It's just the ID up here. So we can replace that with tweet ID. And then for now we'll just display the code. But we don't want to do that for too many, so let's just change it to 10, or in fact just 3 will give us the idea. I think we need to up our tweet count in order to get a result. There we go. Let's have a look at the source of that. So it returns various bits of information as always, but what we're really interested in is the HTML part. So instead of just displaying the whole of the embed code, let's echo the embed and then just the HTML. Okay, let's refresh that. I may need to increase the count again. There we go. Great. And now if we increase the count to say 100, let's take a look. It might take a little while to load, but we'll get a nice list of tweets, all relevant to me because they're on my timeline, all displaying nicely, and all with at least 2 favorites. So that's great. I'm going to leave that to you to improve if you want. I'm not going to spend a long time giving it a background and all of that kind of thing. If you think this app might be useful for you, then please do that, play around with it, and of course post in the forums. But that brings us to the end of the APIs section of the course. Hopefully you've learned how to connect to an API via JavaScript and PHP, getting data in the format of both JSON and XML. And in the next set of videos, we'll see how to create a mobile app which you can put on the app stores using just web technologies.